Hello everyone, welcome to the Ridgefield History Club here at the Scott House at 4 Sunset Lane in Ridgefield, Connecticut. I'm Stephen Bartkus, the Executive Director of the Ridgefield Historical Society. The Historical Society is dedicated to collecting, preserving, and sharing the amazing history of Ridgefield, and we welcome all of you to get involved and become volunteers and members of the Historical Society. Today is September 17th, 2024, and we're going to be discussing the Battle of Ridgefield today with our very special guest, Keith Jones, who has written a new book called The Battle of Ridgefield, Benedict Arnold, the Patriot Militia, and the surprising 1777 battle that galvanized revolutionary Connecticut. This book integrates findings from a new generation of historians with the Ridgefield Historical Society's National Park Service 2022 Ridgefield Battlefield Protection Program Phase 1 study and a digital trove of never-before-published archival primary source material. This book is initially exclusively available for sale here at the Ridgefield Historical Society and on our website, and I encourage you all to pick up a copy for yourselves. Keith was a corporate marketing executive who served as the founding president of the Ridgefield Historical Society. So we are so grateful to him for our very existence. He is an independent historian who has written several history books. Keith is also a reenactor in the 5th Connecticut Regiment. And interestingly, he is a descendant of the Chief Justice of the U.S. Supreme Court, John Marshall. Please join me in welcoming our special guest, Keith Jones, to the Ridgefield History Club today.
Thank you, Steve, and thanks to the Historical Society. First, I have to say that the founder of Ridgefield Historical Society was Jean Timpanelli. Her vision, her ability to inspire people to invest in the community was unmatched. And those of you who knew Jean, she was short, she was quiet, and she would, in her soft voice, ask you to do something and then turn those big brown eyes and just look until you said yes, and you had to say yes. And so that's how I became part of the founding of this historical society. And this old building, seeing it taken down, I remember when out on the ground there was nothing but a hole here, and every timber had a number on it there and was put together like a Lego set. And every time to come back and see what a gift this building was. And of course, as you all know, during the Battle of Ridgefield, the Scott House was actually on Main Street, and these timbers saw that whole battle take place. And 71-year-old Vivis Dauchy, who was a French Huguenot, who was clearly not on England's side, but went to St. Stephen's at a time. He went to the Church of England, and yet he was on the Patriot side. You can imagine him in this building at 71 years old, maybe peering out the window, probably not, as the whole battle rushed by. Anyway, thank you, Steve. Before I begin, just a question. How many of you, a show of hands, have been to a Battle of Ridgefield presentation by someone before? Okay, so it's
everybody.
Yeah. I don't think you're allowed to buy a home in Ridgefield unless you can actually give a battlefield tour. It's a resource-rich community. So what I'm going to do is take you through, I guess, probably the latest, and I call the definitive account of the Battle of Ridgefield. And my presentation will have 3 parts. And so what I thought we'd do is take questions at the end of each one of the parts. And the first part is the historiography, i.e. that's the history of the Battle of Ridgefield, because that's a learning experience in itself. The second part is the battle, which we finally are getting a grip on to define it as a true battle, not just this anecdotal collection of folk tales that added up to make the town proud, but a true battle. And then the third part are the consequences, because the consequences of the stand at Ridgefield really did contribute toward ensuring Great Britain lost the war. And a lot of the dealing with Ridgefield has not followed up with, well, what happened months afterwards as the dominoes fell. So if you excuse me a minute, I will sit, saving my energy. And this is probably going to be deep history for you all, because that's where I write, deep history, dense history with lots of facts. And like my son told me on the last book, he just couldn't get through it. It was so densely written. So I'll try to make it as easy as I can for you. I guess we're taking an adventure really into the past. And have any of you heard of Joseph J. Ellis, the historian Joseph Ellis? He's the author of the Pulitzer Prize-winning Founding Brothers. Well, his latest book is called The Cause, which, to my money, is the best small single volume to help you understand the War for Independence. But anyway, he opens up with a statement that really struck me, and that the past, keep in mind the past, we think the past is not history. I love the way he puts it. It's a vaster region of the dead, the gone, the unknowable, or the forgotten. History is what we choose to remember, not necessarily what happened in the past. And to give you an example of that, and I wrestle with this in my book, is Sybil Ludington. This is a statue in front of the Danbury Public Library, as well as other places, touting Sybil, this 16-year-old girl who went on a 40-mile ride in the dark to alert the soldiers of Colonel Ludington, her father, in Dutchess County. Well, the fact is, her father was colonel of the 7th Regiment of Dutchess County Militia, and at least 4 companies of that regiment did get to Danbury and fought in part of the Battle of Ridgefield, and she was indeed his daughter. And the town of Carmel has 33 monuments about the route that if she had taken the ride, she might have gone. And it even ended up with a postage stamp from the federal government. And yet there is not one shred of evidence that it ever happened. There is no family letter, there is no diary. Of the 112 members of her father's regiment who left anything, none of them mentioned the ride. The 33 markers, none of the people who lived there left any mention that she passed and knocked on that door. And in fact, nobody said anything about it until 1880, when a children's book writer who was also a very good historian wrote a history of New York, and she mentioned it and referred to family papers, which are yet to be found. So I kept scratching myself. Do I include Sybil in the book? And I basically concluded, well, no, if I don't have any facts, how can I do it? Now, does that mean she never went on the ride? Well, of course not. If you were a 16-year-old farm girl or farm boy in 1777 going on a long ride on a horse, it was the least extraordinary thing you could imagine, so there would have been no reason, really, for anyone to record it. Any kid could have done it. So, did it happen? Well, maybe someday someone will have the facts to tell us, but to my mind, this is history remembered without a factual base, and so therefore I couldn't include it going forward. But going forward, to summarize the history of the Battle of Ridgefield, there's really 4 stages here. It started off regarded as a skirmish when it happened, 1777. Curiously, by the time we entered the 19th century, it became regarded by historians as an episode in failure, both on the British part and on the American part. It wasn't really until 1927, on the 150th anniversary of the battle, that our local historian Rockwell called it a battle. First one really to say full battle. And now we're on the verge in a couple of years of having the National Park Service not only call it a battle, but claim that this is a battlefield for National Battlefield Protection Site. So this is all history remembered, the same history, but the remembrance changes over time. So, you know, that's a big black hole in the past that we're digging into, and each person who comes back with something different. But anyway, it's an exciting point now to say the men who fought here are getting the recognition that they long to. Well, let me recap each of these 4 stages. This is the Connecticut Journal of 3 days after the battle. that said it was a stubborn skirmish. I don't know whether you can read back there. Okay. So they're gonna, which continued about an hour, in which our men behaved with great spirit, but being overpowered by number were obliged to give way. That still holds up. However, the same account in British New York read like this: a minor skirmish carried after small opposition with considerable loss on the side of the rebels. So, same action from two different standpoints. In England, we have this. Everyone knows this print from the Kew Tower Museum. 1780, made probably with eyewitness feedback to the artist there. And it's entitled A Skirmish in America with the King's Troops and General Arnold. So it was a skirmish at the time. That's how it was believed in. Now, we start moving into the 19th century, and Mercy Otis Warren, who wrote one of the best accounts of the American Revolution, but because she was a woman, she just didn't get the credibility. Several volumes. She knew everyone personally, a gifted spirit. She called it, on the trivial expedition to Danbury, a rencounter ensued, when much bravery was exhibited on both sides. Now, it's a rencounter now on a trivial expedition. By 1860, Dawson's History of the Battles of America called it, the expedition to Danbury was as disgraceful to the people of Connecticut who permitted it as to General Tryon who planned and executed it. By the end of the century, Britain's leading historian was calling it a desultory and isolated raid aiming at no solid military advantage, foredoomed to disaster and exceptionally irritating to the local immigrants. So imagine that. If you lived in Ridgefield at about 1900, this is the kind of recounting of what happened on the streets here. And these are all major historians going back to the past with a different memory. Well, Ridgefield was forgotten by 1900. Why? No George Washington, and it was militia. What had happened is when the revolutionary generation died off, they didn't think of founding fathers, because in everybody's town there were heroes who fought. You know, you didn't need a George Washington to tell your children about the war. There was the old guy down the street. They died. The Civil War happened. A whole new series of neighbors were there to talk about war, and it wasn't the revolution. And that's when the founding fathers became kind of the teaching institution in schools and children for the war of the revolution. And when it came to the battlefield, it was George Washington who was the founding father, and it was the Continental Army that fought the war. So no Washington, no militia. It was a British victory, and it didn't alter the course of the war. And Arnold was a traitor, and the stench of his treason, I think, obscured the Ridgefield affair for at least a century. Nathaniel Philbrook, I don't know if you know the name, put out a book about a year ago that was a biography of Arnold and Washington, and he details very clearly that anything Arnold touched for more of a century was pariah. You just didn't go there as an American historian. So Ridgefield had all of that working against it, and so it was forgotten until 1927, on the 150th anniversary. George Rockwell, a Ridgefielder, wrote a history of Ridgefield, and one chapter was called The Battle of Ridgefield. That's the first time anyone said it was a battle. Case, who was a Danbury historian, called it a battle in his account of General Tryon's raid. And Silvio Bedini, on the 175th anniversary, doubled down on the battle with some more facts. In the bicentennial, Robert McDevitt, a Danbury historian again, looked at Tryon's raid from a British standpoint and dubbed it a battle. And then one of the primary books of the bicentennial was Peckham's Campaigns of the Revolution, called the Danbury Campaign. It was one of 41 campaigns of the American Revolution. So we're back, as of the bicentennial, mostly driven by Danbury and Ridgefield historians. Okay, no major nationally prominent historian has yet addressed the Battle of Ridgefield, which creates a nice opportunity for me, but it's coming. You know, in 2027, I really expect national awareness to start taking place. Well, on the 225th anniversary of the battle, another local historian named Jones wrote a book saying, yeah, it was not only a battle, but I want to give you eyewitness version of it as opposed to folk tales. And Chris Collier, Kit was the state historian at the time, said, well, this is going to be the account for a long, long time. Well, a long, long time was not even 25 years. We're 22 years later, and a whole generation of information has altered the script. One, as you all know, online, things that we used to have to go into library back rooms or historical societies to find, or town hall records, are digital now. I can put on a screen 7 or 8 1880s histories of various towns in Ridgefield and go right to who of their men fought here, whether it's Litchfield or Stamford or Fairfield. I can put them all on the screen at one time and tie it together. My first book, I had to go to each town and dig it out. Then an interesting thing, the pension requests, the National Archives have opened up Revolutionary War pensions to online access. So now you can go to individual soldiers who fought and extract their very own words. The British National Archives in 2018 began putting 70,000 colonial documents online. So now I can get the communication between the British generals in London and see the real politics that was going on behind the scene. And then most importantly, here in 2013, the National Archives put online Founders Online, in which for the top 6 or 7 founding fathers, every piece of correspondence is now digitally online, every letter. So now I could see that George Washington was involved. He was involved every day in the events around the Battle of Ridgefield, because he was in communications with the generals and Governor Trumbull, and all of those letters are now online, plus the footnotes that add even more intoxicating stuff. Then Stephen Darley in 2015, I don't know if you know the name, but he put together a list of over 1,000 men in 58 militia companies who were likely present during the Battle of Ridgefield. So I didn't have that way back then. So now all of this has come together with the National Park Service Phase 1 study that concluded in 2022, which really opened up the scope of the battle geographically, as well as the order of battle. You can't have a battle unless you say what is the order of battle, and that hadn't really been defined before. That is, how did the troops arraign themselves on either side, the orders of battle? Well, they articulated that. So pulling all that together enables a historian to tell a much more eyewitness version of what exactly happened, or we, to our best of our ability, happened. And for me, it ends up turning a skirmish in the Danbury Raid into a battle where General Tryon's vision for loyalist hegemony over southwestern Connecticut came to die. Because until his expedition hit Ridgefield, he encountered almost no opposition. And as I'll explain, he really had sound belief for thinking that bringing an army into this part of Connecticut would lead to rising up, as part of Westchester County had, and create a sense of civil war. And of course, he was an ambitious man, and he saw himself as a lead protagonist there. So to tell the Battle of Ridgefield, to change it from this to this, involves layering in 2 stories, which is, my book is really 2 stories. One is the events on the ground from eyewitnesses that sequence 4 days culminating in the Battle of Ridgefield. The other is the story of 5 men whose ambition and whose command made the things happen on the ground. And I found that a very fascinating story because each had his own weaknesses and strengths. And we start with the first of them, William Tryon. Imagine my surprise when I wrote to the North Carolina Museum asking permission to use this portrait of Tryon, which has been circulating, I don't know, maybe 50, 75 years. They said, no. Why? They said, because we don't think that's him. Now, there are books that have him on the cover as the biography of William Tryon, and they said, that's not right, and so we're not going to release anymore, and please don't show this. Well, so I didn't put it in the book, but I have a hard time talking about him without some depiction of whether that's him or not. It doesn't mean it's not. Anyway, William Tryon is the reason why the Battle of Ridgefield happened. William Tryon was a competent governor of New York and North Carolina before that. Probably one of the finest of the colonial governors that England sent out here in terms of balancing the crown versus the interests of the aristocracy. No one cared about the tradesmen or the working people. It was the aristocracy who represented America as far as England was concerned. And he found himself, once the conflict began, emasculated. When General Howe came in with 30,000 troops and replaced civil law with military law, he was essentially out of a job. And he'd set up a spy network quite extensively throughout, from New England to Philadelphia. He put at Howe's disposal. But he really wanted to be a general in the army because that's where the action was. And so he, in December of 1776, what big action happened in December of 1776? Well, while the British were celebrating Christmas in New York, thinking the war is over, we've driven the army, we've destroyed Washington, we've got New York, it's just a matter of time. Washington crossed the Delaware at Trenton and took out the Hessians to the tune of about 1,200 troops, and then it repeated his act at Princeton. And Tryon got so excited about this that he saw an opening, and so he wrote to England, to his boss, Lord George Germain, who was also his superior's boss, went around his superior, General Howe, asking to be Major General of provincial troops, and suggesting that southwestern Connecticut really was loyal to the crown, and all that they needed was him and an army to come in, and friends of the crown would rise up. He wasn't far wrong, you know. Ridgefield did not approve Continental Congress until not only after Lexington Concord, but not till 6 months after Bunker Hill did Ridgefield vote to disavow the crown. And Ridgefield was one of 5 towns in Fairfield County who stayed with the crown all the way up until Bunker Hill, and who did not send men officially to Bunker Hill. The Loyalist embedding in this part of Connecticut has kind of been a dirty secret that has been lost, because we were the provision state. We were the state that kept Washington's army alive, but there was this vulnerable spot that Tryon saw. So he sent his request to London. He then met with Sir William Howe and proposed a plan about how he would take on New York and Connecticut with Loyalist troops. And Loyalist regiments were building up at that time. King George had blessed his plan and the rank on April 2nd. On the 20th, he was made Major General of Provincials with the King's blessing, and on the 25th, he lands at Campo with his army, and in the back of his mind, expecting that he's going to receive with open arms, or at least without opposition, and he was right. Now, he reported militarily to Sir William Howe, who reported to Lord George Germain, just as Tryon reported to George Germain as governor in his civil rule. So he had 2 bosses, and Howe was waking up to the fact that he had a war to fight in 1777. It wasn't a cakewalk, and he had to put together a plan. And his plan involved taking out George Washington's army on the way to Philadelphia and cutting off his supply lines from New England before he did it. And so he was happy to let the saber-rattling Tryon lead the expedition to burn the Danbury supply depot. He did not have a high regard for Tryon. He thought he was a political general, and Howe earned his stripes. He was Knight Commander of the British Empire. He jumped over 111 men in seniority to be named the senior commander here. He had a distinguished battle record. He was England's most decorated general, and his troops loved him because he took care of them and he physically was in the field. But he didn't trust Tryon to lead this expedition because he was a political general. The real leader of Tryon's raid was Brigadier General Sir William Erskine. When you start getting into the men who were there on the British side, they all say he called the shots. He was the one who ran the expedition. Tryon was a face man who was expecting to have tea and crackers with everybody and welcome back to the crown along the route. Sir William is one of those amazing people who you never heard of. He was knighted in the 1850s as a cavalry leader at the Battle of Elmsdorf in Germany, when his cavalry unit overran 16 different enemy units and captured their banners, and he physically presented 16 captured banners to King George, who knighted him on the spot. And he was distinguished everywhere he went. And so Howe named him to the expedition, and Tryon very smartly realized that he was a better commander, and to his credit, Tryon gave real control over troops on the ground to Sir William. Sir William put together an army that had more troops than were Lexington, Concord, Princeton, or Trenton. The battles we've all heard of, the army that came here had more British soldiers than any of those others, because Erskine took 6 of the finest British infantry regiments, really the best of the best, and he took half of each regiment, so they were picked men. We had a regiment of colonials from Connecticut, who were the Prince of Wales American Volunteers. He had 6 artillery pieces that came along, and he had a squadron of the 17th Mounted Dragoons. So this was a powerhouse, formidable army that the British landed on Campo on the 25th of April, headed for Danbury. Ridgefield wasn't in anybody's mind then. Burn Danbury, get back to the ships. Wasn't going to be a problem. Connecticut was full of Tories. Cakewalk. Well, as we know, let me add this, Sir William also outfitted his staff with the very cream of the British officer corps. You've never heard of him, Major Charles Stewart. He was a staff officer with Erskine. He rose to the rank of Lieutenant General. He was knighted. He became Sir Charles. But here he's 24 years old as a major, 24 years old, from the top of the aristocracy. This is the kind of officer he had on his staff. He was knighted. How? He took the island of Malta from the Spanish without losing a man, and became knighthood, became lieutenant general, became commander of all the British armies in Europe at one point. This is the kind of guy Erskine brought with him. He also brought an engineer. In those days, when the British Army went in the field, you took an engineer with you because you had bridges, you had logs that had to be cut, etc. He took the best, Captain Lieutenant Archibald Robinson. He became a lieutenant general too. He ended up heading the entire Royal Engineer Corps for the British Army. So there probably wasn't a man in Erskine's army who wasn't the best of the best for this. He also left a diary, which many of you may know, which is one of the best eyewitness accounts of the raid. Well, they were in Danbury, having captured Danbury, and then opposition formed. Who should arrive but 66-year-old Major General of Connecticut Militia, David Wooster, who had a 35-year career fighting. He had a captain's commission in the British Army. He had such a distinguished youth that after the Battle of Louisburg in 1759 or something, I think, he was sent to England as part of the group that brought the news to the king, and he was presented to the king, and he was given a captain's commission in the British Army for life. Well, he decided to change sides during the Revolution, and his career didn't go so well. He was attributed for losing part of Canada. Everybody we sent there, of course, lost Canada, but you had to have a scapegoat. Congress could accept blame themselves. And he was old, and he was conservative, and he pissed off the New York troops, which was not a good idea. He also lost Washington's confidence because he retreated too quickly from an encounter on the New York line down outside of Greenwich. So he was pretty much consigned to history. And it was his duty to come here, but you can also sense that he probably saw a closing chapter to his resume to clean it up. And so he had personal reasons in addition to a duty. So at 66, he got on a horse with a couple of aides and rode during the rain from New Haven to Reading, where he met another general, Benedict Arnold, who at that time was probably the premier fighting general of the Continental Army. He was called America's Hannibal because he had led an expedition through the Maine wilderness in the middle of winter to the gates of Quebec, assaulted Quebec, was wounded. He then was given a command to stop the British onslaught coming down from Canada in Lake George in that area, which he didn't beat him, but he delayed it till winter, so he got credit for that. He was a fighting general, and he'd just been passed over for a second promotion to Major General by 5 brigadiers less qualified. And he was in a huff, and he was going to Philadelphia to resign. He'd had it. He'd also gotten a letter when he was in New Haven that he was rejected for marriage. Evidently, when he was in Boston, he was struck at a salon by a 16-year-old Boston girl, and he, within a week, decided to propose marriage to her and sent her a trunk full of the latest clothing from Boston stores. And then her mom stepped in and sent him a letter saying the lovely Betsy is not for you, calling him lame and of middling income and a rebel general, since she turned out to be a loyalist. But he was an impetuous man, let's put it that way. That impetuosity, though, led him to say, if I get to Ridgefield, maybe I can get that second star, because his promotion to colonel and to brigadier were all after the fact for battlefield valor. So why not go for a third time? So uninvited, this Continental general just rode, and he got to Reading before Worcester did. And these two were oil and water. How they worked out the command, you couldn't tell. 67 versus 36. Rising star, falling star. Conservative, impetuous. But they ended up in Bethel at midnight. British had taken Danbury, begun the destruction of the depot, and the core of their command was another general, Benjamin Silliman of Fairfield, who commanded one of 6 regiments of militia. And these guys are the real heroes of the whole campaign, the names that we never heard of, because Silliman had 4 regiments. They were from every town in Fairfield County, plus he had a regiment from Litchfield County that covered Woodbury, New Milford, in Kent. And men from all of those were here. 1,203 men on paper, but 250 had been sent to Peekskill, which left in maybe 1,000, and from what we could tell, about 600 actually turned out to be with the 3 generals at Bethel, figuring out what are we going to do about this British Army. Well, what are we going to do? They determined to divide the command in 2 pieces, because they didn't know whether General Tryon would come back to his ships at Campo the same way he came, or whether he would come back by a different route. So Arnold and Silliman had 400 troops towards the Ridgefield side of Reading, and Worcester took 200 troops, and they would support one another whichever way the British went. Now there's a wild card in the Battle of Ridgefield, and that's General Alexander McDougall, who commanded the Continental troops at Peekskill, 1,200 of them. At any time, if he had decided to march toward Danbury or Ridgefield, it was a game changer. Would have pretty much evened the odds, and had professional soldiers, although they really were still pretty raw, on the scene. He was a flinty Scotsman, self-made man, one of George Washington's early war favorites, handpicked by Washington for Peekskill. But he didn't come. Well, he came but too late and turned around and went back. Why didn't he come? This man. And I love this picture of Washington. This was painted in 1776, so this is how he looked, maybe 6 months before the Battle of Ridgefield. You can see this is a strong, graceful inspiring man. Of course, these paintings are always this way, but there's a sense of the young George Washington here that does emanate strength. He personally selected Peekskill because of the Hudson River crossing, and he needed New England supplies to get to Pennsylvania, and he needed a crossing, and so Peekskill was the post there, and he personally selected Danbury as the primary supply nexus for all of New England men and material before they went to Peekskill, because he thought it was far enough inland from the Hudson, which it was, 35 miles for the British to come, but he didn't think that the British would come from Long Island Sound, because this was pretty rugged country. Governor Trumbull of Connecticut feared for Danbury and asked several times, put some troops here, and Washington turned him down. Obviously, if every state who said, give me some troops, he wouldn't have an army, and he didn't have much of one anyway. At any rate, he ordered McDougal to be ready to come to his aid in Philadelphia, because he thought the decoy up the Hudson River that was sent to distract from the Campo landing was really an attack coming for Philadelphia. So he said, stay ready to come to my aid. So McDougal is pinned there and not able to come to Danbury's aid. So those are the major players as we put this together. The other thing is, I found out, this is really interesting, I'd never seen this before. Washington was warned 4 days before Danbury was burned that the exact words for Brigadier General Parsons were, the enemy will land on the coast about 20 miles from this place, he was in Danbury, and attempt to destroy the magazine provisions here. Neither Parsons, who really should have done something, I mean he was there, and he commanded the Connecticut line, nor Washington did anything about it. Turns out a spy was captured, he was court-martialed, he was sentenced to hang, and in the course of the trial he spilled the beans on the British were coming. But since they didn't know the exact day the British were coming, and troops were scarce, Washington did nothing. In fact, he didn't even reply to the memo until May 7th. Pretty much saying, I don't know, I don't want to touch this. So he knew, now, all of this now put together into the Battle of Ridgefield itself, so let's stop. Any questions on the ground we've covered from historiography standpoint?
Do you anticipate more coming out?
Of course.
Do you see places where it's going to come from?
The phase 2 study that will happen here could turn out that there's still areas of we don't know of where General Wooster's command went after he was mortally wounded and they fragmented. I mean, some people think they came around and came and joined the battle in Ridgefield itself. So we don't know any of that logistics, and so maybe something will come out there. New York, there were 9 different companies, New York militia that fought here, and we Connecticut people have kind of told the story from Connecticut standpoint and ignored that. At some point, some New York historian will probably dig really deep into that and come up with some information. I think there's still the mystery of Arnold being shot. While there are eyewitnesses that attend to it, they conflict on what exactly happened there. So more of that will come out for sure. And there were people in the houses along Main Street, and who knows what they wrote down and passed on in their family that's in an attic somewhere. So if you remember that chart that I showed from 1777 to 2027, how things changed, sure, more's going to come. That's for sure. Any other thoughts? Yes, sir.
I think there are like 3 things that add texture to sort of the personality forces that you've pointed out. I think one is that Tryon. Do you think he might have been motivated by Arnold's actions in Lake Champlain? Because that was, I mean, the army, the British forces were supposed to come down Lake Champlain and arrive at Saratoga in '76, which would have effectively cut New England off. So I think perhaps the failure of the general up there was could have been a motivation for him.
Well, I guess what other historians have written was that Tryon was awakened at about 1 in the morning on the morning of the 27th with word that not only had the Patriots collected an army, but Arnold was rumored to be with him. And that the reason he headed back toward Ridgefield was he didn't want to take on Arnold because they had big numbers of troops wrong. They overestimated, and so he didn't want to take it on. Because even George Germain in London had written that a year before that Arnold seems to be the most active of all the American generals. So yes, if indeed he was notified that Arnold was there, and why not? He had a spy network all over the place. That no, he didn't want to deal with Arnold. That's correct. Yeah. And you had another point.
Oh, I did. Sorry. Yes. So Worcester. I don't know. I think we need to sort of reconsider him because I think because the Battle of Ridgefield, he's remembered in a very heroic light. But you know, to be fair, in Canada, he did attempt to impose a Puritan rule on the Catholics.
He was favored. He favored the Connecticut troops indiscriminately. He had a fusty old I-know-it-all attitude from what I could put together, and that was a fluid situation on the ground. So he was the wrong general. So I mean, and he made a number of mistakes because of conservatism. So I mean, it was justified that his reputation was questioned, although youthful. Maybe he was a different man. But you have to assume he saw a chance here to kind of write the last sentence, and I'm sure he didn't intend to die.
Right.
but
it would be the last sentence.
He wanted to have a statement of duty that was positive, right? Exactly. So one more. Yeah.
Sorry. General. So Parsons, not a general at that time actually, but Parsons was thought to be a spy at that time.
There was rumor that he was playing both ends of the game.
Which I don't think he was.
There was no evidence. There's no evidence whatsoever other than the British said there was one high-ranking Connecticut general who had given indication he would come over at the right time to their side, but they didn't name him.
Right.
So it could have been Parsons or maybe not. We don't know. I think not, and one of the reasons why I'll get when we get into the consequences of the raid. Yeah.
Yeah. So I just wonder if that's why Washington ignored his letter because of the rumors.
I don't know at that time. I think Washington was not happy with Parsons because Connecticut was very slow in delivering their 8 regiments, and he kept telling Parsons, "Send the troops. When are they coming?" And Parsons kept giving him bland answers because the troops were slow in assembling. So I sense that Washington did not have confidence as Parsons as someone he would move on getting a letter from with the same alacrity he would have from McDougal. And as you know, in Reading, William Herron, who was a delegate to the state legislature from Herron and head of their town committee for recruiting troops, was in fact a double agent, maybe even a triple agent, and entertained the British in his home when they passed through. So things were murky in this part of Connecticut, and Washington was probably wise to get corroboration on anything that came out of here other than McDougal, who was clearly his man. Well, anyway, I tried to pull all of that then together to give a new look at what really happened here. And the fact was, the battle was not this one-off go burn Danbury because we got a message that the depot was there. It was part of General Howe's 1777 campaign plan that he sent to England for his total campaign to destroy Washington in the field while capturing Philadelphia. And the first step on that was to take out New England's supply chain. On March 22nd, he sent an expedition up the Hudson that destroyed the Peekskill supply depot. On April 2nd, he gave Tryon 3,000 men to enter Connecticut as circumstances permit. This was part of the plan that was approved by King George. On the 15th of April, he created a demonstration in northern New Jersey where he had 10,000 troops to decoy Washington to make him think the campaign was about to begin. On the 20th of April, he gave Tryon orders to destroy Danbury Depot, and then on the 21st of April, 2 fleets shoved off. One with Tryon came up the East River and into Long Island Sound to land. Another fleet, the very same size, went up the Hudson to decoy an attack on Peekskill and help pin General McDougall, who we met in Peekskill, because there's a fleet that had troop ships there. Were they going to land there? So he was pinned to the ground. A brilliant plan. Howe really thought it out. It wasn't just this raid, send some guys out and burnt Danbury Depot. The other thing we know is that Crown loyalism in southwestern Connecticut was real. And Tryon had told Howe, you can count on me, we'll deal with this. And Tryon had good reason to believe that. One, the Church of England. Fairfield County, nearly 1 out of 3 churchgoers still attended the Church of England. At least that's what Episcopal historians tell us. They probably overestimate. You always overestimate for your side. But these people were still keeping one foot in the ground. And the liturgy of the Church of England prayed to save the life of King George. That was in the morning prayer. So you can imagine how a congregationalist felt about that. Also, many of the militia did not muster earlier in the year when the call went out to fight the British in New York. I was able to research 16 different companies of Connecticut men, and over 400 individuals were given writs to appear before court for not mustering to fight the British. There were also 4 regiments of Connecticut men who had fled to Long Island to join the British Army and wear the green uniform of an American volunteer who was suited up to fight. So Tryon thought, wow, they were all coming from this loyalist-infested area. And there were what you would call closet Tories, people whose affinity was really with England, but they knew if they went public, they could be fined, their property could be taken, their business boycotted, their mail opened. So it was much more easier to just keep your mouth shut, but see how the wind was blowing. And then in lower Westchester County, there was a civil war going on. British and Patriots every night were colliding farm by farm for who's in control. And that went on through most of the Revolution. That as long as the British were in New York, that was going on. So Tryon had all of that in his mind, thinking when he landed that he not only wouldn't have much opposition, but he could recruit, and maybe he could light some fires and get some action going on. So there we go, okay. Well, even Worcester, when he arrived, saw Danbury burning, wrote to Governor Trumbull that there may be greater danger from the Western Tories than from the regulars. Everyone knew. Even Continental Congress knew. I love this. This is what John Adams wrote to Abigail after Danbury was burned. The stupid, sordid, cowardly, torrified country people, that's Fairfield County, let them pass without opposition. So, I mean, even Congress knew that southwestern Connecticut was still in play. Anyway, the other thing we find is the battle was really a continuous day-long battle. Traditionally, it was described as 3 engagements. The first 2 engagements with Worcester, the 3rd engagement at the barricade. But from eyewitnesses, the shooting began as soon as they crossed into Ridgebury. There were pot shots that took place all the way along. And the engagements took place. The first one, of course, when Worcester swept out of the woods around where the Scott School is now up in the Scotland district. That end area is where the British apparently camped. A wonderful area to do excavation work. And the whole army camps for even for a couple hours. There's stuff that's kind of be in the ground. Well, Worcester surprised them just as they were getting back on the march, had finished their meal, and captured about half of the supply train, took 40 prisoners, and from what I can tell, killed 2 men, either there or later on, two British, without losing a man, and then disappeared back as rapidly as he can, because the British were on the march. It was a rear guard action, and he hit and run. The second engagement, Worcester came back, and it was not a surprise. I'll address that in a minute. But one thing we've discovered is Worcester had a much larger command than has been previously mounted. Everything I've seen before was that they had 600 men, 400 with Arnold and Silliman, 200 with Worcester. Those 200 were right here. the 16th and 13th Militia of General Silliman's. He was joined by 150 men by Major Beardsley out of New Fairfield and New Milford, plus 6 companies of New York militia. The Ludington group of 3 or 4, and then another 3 from the 2nd Westchester and the 3rd Westchester regiments came from the other directions. Now, they hadn't physically linked up, but they apparently were in communication and operating together. Plus, from Litchfield, the 17th Militia, which was not part of Silliman's Fairfield County Command, Milford Militia, 2nd Militia, all of these individuals are coming up through pension requests that they were at the Battle of Ridgefield. And so, in fact, Wooster's command was probably twice as big as we've given him credit for. Because I always wondered, why would he, as the senior officer, take 200 men and give Arnold and Silliman 400 men, unless he wanted Arnold to do the fighting? Well, it was because he knew he had these others to balance out roughly equal numbers if he could. So that was really pretty much a new finding for me that was, I think, first surfaced by the National Park Study report that I drilled down on. The other thing is the second engagement, it was not a heroic charge by Wooster. We're finding from eyewitnesses that General Erskine knew that Wooster was following him, and at a bend in the road on Route 116, right around where Takora Trail comes in, the road bent, and Wooster couldn't see what was happening in the British Army, and Erskine put 3 artillery pieces plus a rear guard, most likely primed and loaded, as Wooster came around the bend. And he ran into that, and his horse, his mount, was killed immediately, and he did lead men forward to try and capture one of the artillery pieces, from what I can tell. But we have several eyewitnesses that say he was then almost immediately surrounded and ordered to retreat. And it's when he mounted a second horse and they were retreating was when he was shot obliquely in the side. So still a heroic wounding. But most of the early stuff I read was, "Come on, rush on, my boys, follow me into the arms," when in fact he was shot on the way getting out of the action. The other thing is, some major league historians have written that his son Thomas was bayoneted there and died with his son, which is absolutely untrue. I mean, Philbrook even had that in his book, and James Kirby Martin, who has probably the leading biography of Benedict Arnold before Philbrooks had passed this on, and it's absolutely untrue. He was at Valley Forge, and he resigned his commission in 1779. He died on a riverboat in Los Angeles in 1841, and Wooster only had one son, so no son of Wooster died at his side for sure. But here we have it now. Wooster's mortally wounded. The British are on the march, trying to avoid Arnold, when in fact they're marching straight into Arnold toward Ridgefield. Which leads us, I don't know if you've seen this before. This is a drawing done in 1860 by Benjamin Lossing, who wrote a sketchbook about the War for Independence. And so this is the Benjamin Stebbins house on the right there, where Casagmo is now going down the hill, and that's the road in which the barricade was placed, in which you can just imagine Arnold's men getting there about an hour before the British, and just getting everything they could to construct a barricade there. And it's an extraordinary defensive spot. You can go there today and drive through that little notch in the road, and you can see how the road twists and falls off. And there was a hill there and stream at the bottom. It was a mini Bunker Hill kind of situation, in fact, in which the British would have to storm uphill against a strong defense. There were rocky ledges on this side that I think Arnold thought were unclimbable, so he neglected to fully defend. And so you say, gosh, if I could only know what was in the minds of those men as they collected at that barricade and saw this half a mile long army coming toward them with band playing, brilliant uniforms, mounted cavalry, what was going through their heads. But as a reenactor, I can tell you, I know one thing they knew. They knew that every one of those British soldiers carried the short land pattern musket, the Brown Bess. They knew that. And they knew that the Brown Bess was 75 caliber. The M16 rifle that our troops are equipped today with is 50 caliber. So the size of that musket ball, and it wasn't shaped like a bullet to penetrate. It was round but flattened as it moved. It was there to smash and tear a huge gap. They knew that was what was coming at them from men who could unleash 3 rounds a minute, maybe 4, as trained professionals, firing en masse with 3 times the number of them. That's was in the mind of been in my mind if I were there, and I was looking at every one of them carrying the standard issue Brown Bess, and they knew how to use it, and they also had a 17-inch bayonet. They had that our guys didn't. So it was not going to be a long battle. Everyone knew that. But here's how it's transpired, to the best of our knowledge. I don't know how well you can see that in the back. See the red dot in the middle, the red square? That's the Benjamin Stebbins house, which is where Casagmo stands now. You can see the red line going through is Route 16, then becoming Main Street, going through the town on the south. You can see the British brigade advancing. Arnold deployed his troops. He put the 4th Connecticut Regiment, his largest one, right at the barricade. He had some Continental soldiers from the 5th and 6th Connecticut Regiments who were either new enlistees or freshly uniformed, if uniformed at all. He had the 2nd New York Regiment here, although there's no evidence the colonel ever materialized. And he had over on the far right, defending his other flank, the 9th Connecticut Regiment. So Arnold's order of battle was all 3 ridges. You know, Ridgefield is 3 parallel ridges. Well, the choke point on Main Street was one, but High Ridge here and East Ridge there. I don't know the condition of the roads at that time, but there probably were farm trails. He had large bodies of men. He said 150 of his 600, or excuse me, 500 on each side, leaving him about 200 in the middle. In the back, he had horses. We find from eyewitnesses that many of the militia came on horseback, and they pooled the horses in the back so to expedite their getaway. They weren't all just running around on foot, and I hadn't learned that before. Arnold being in the rear. So the battle opens when the British are coming down the road. They see there's opposition here. Erskine puts all 6 artillery pieces to the rear and begins to shell the barricade. At the same time, he says large regimental-sized bodies to each flank to probe the flank, just to see whether he could do a flanking action. Found out he could, that the flanks are manned. He then determined, as best we can tell, to, in one big assault, throw everything he had, all at once on both flanks. He brought 3 artillery pieces up to the front, shelled the barricade, and then sent 600 men in a column that then fanned out as they approached the barricade, while about 250 men were approaching each one of the flanks simultaneously with the cannonade in front of them. So that's a huge assault by 3 times the number of troops that, as best we can tell, we were there. Well, as you might expect, if you remember General Israel Putnam at the Battle of Bunker Hill said, "Don't fire till you see the whites of their eyes." And there is evidence that Arnold's men tried to hold off on their first volley until they were in killing range. And the action began, and the whole affair took about an hour, from the first shelling to chasing the Americans down the street and out of town, which is longer than some of the other estimates took, although there are various reports. The British, like you saw from the newspaper article earlier on, said it was over, no opposition, and then the American generals, of course, made themselves look as good as they could in their report on how sturdily the men fought at Ridgefield. At any rate, Arnold's whole front apparently gave way all at once. Both flanks, as well as the middle, started to give way, and Arnold, with a group of people around him, then spurred his horse up to the front to rally his troops. When over these ledges, the provincial troops of Connecticut men, for the most part, who were part of the British Army as a provincial regiment, climbed up over the stony cliffs that Arnold didn't think they might do, and appeared at the top and unleashed a volley that we know felled Arnold's horse. There's plenty of eyewitnesses for that. Up until the National Park Service report, the standard account of what happened next to Arnold would seem to be that he ran away into the swamp, nearby swamp. That seems to be, there's no hard documentation, but Rockwell perpetuated that, and others followed up on it. Well, 2 eyewitnesses say no, he commandeered a horse after he pulled out his pistol and shot an attacker. He commandeered a horse and rode away, and one of them said he took it from a British soldier. So that's still yet to be resolved. I'm inclined to say, of course, he rode on a horse. I mean, he's the commander, he's going to go on foot, and there were plenty of horses being kept in the back. So Arnold orders a retreat, and for militia, from what we can tell, the retreat was as orderly as militia could retreat. And the British were not here to try and kill as many Americans as possible. Remember, they thought this was loyalist territory, and if you treated people with civility and respect, they were likely to possibly stay loyal. And so there's evidences of restraint as the British came through Ridgefield. No homes were burned along the town, although the church of St. Stephen's, where Patriot supplies were held, was set aflame, and Keeler Tavern was about to be burned, according to a story. And while I didn't include Sybil Ludington, I couldn't not include the burning, potential burning of Keeler Tavern, and the loyalists who apparently asked that the tavern be saved, because there are witnesses that the tavern had been struck by cannonballs, one still there, and that the soldiers were in there. And British practice was to burn. If they were fired upon from a house, they would burn the house. And there were soldiers firing from around the house. So most likely somebody kept the Keeler Tavern from being burned down, and since Benjamin Hoyt was a neighbor, and he and his father had helped build the house before they sold it to Keeler, there's probably some credibility there, and that's another story maybe we'll get more about. Well, so after an hour, it's now 4:30 going on 5 o'clock, and the British move through town. They sweep both of the ridges. They sweep around on Olmsted Lane, clear that out. The New York militia apparently had an engagement on the end of near Route 35, for that hits Main Street, because several houses were burned there, and that meant somebody was firing from the house, and that's the route back the New York militia would have taken, because they were Pound Ridge and Salem men. So something went on there that we really don't know anything about, other than houses were burned. And down south of town, the British camped for the night. The next morning at the crack of dawn, they marched toward Campo. Arnold met them again and fought fiercely at Campo Hill. And at this time he had 1,000 men or more, and more were arriving from New Haven. So that was a closer call than we've been led to expect as to what might have happened there had his men not run away, because that's what happened. At Campo Hill, Erskine ordered a bayonet charge, and the militia simply ran. Arnold's whole command broke and ran and kept on running. They were so far away that he couldn't regroup, and the British went back to New York. So that kind of summarizes the Battle of Ridgefield itself as best it can be put together. And in my book, I have like 30-some men who were there, and their little piece of the battle, as well as the officers' command reports. So the heroism, and I'm finding from the men that were killed, and I'll get into that in a minute, is that most of them were not young boys. They were men in their 30s with families. That's what the militia was. And of course there were some young men as well, but the older ones who were in leadership positions were the ones who died. Well, how many died? This is another interesting. Ben Stebbins, by the way, stayed in his house the whole time. He's 86 years old. The battle is going on, and he's there. And he wrote that he thought there were 40 to 50 American lives lost. General Arnold said about Lieutenant Colonel Gould and about 20 were killed both at Ridgefield and Campo. You can give a number for Ridgefield. General Silliman said Gould and 8 or 9 others were killed at Ridgefield. And Colonel Hughes, a Continental officer who was riding through, said that the word was that 32 were lost at Ridgefield. And of course the British said hundreds. You know, when you're writing up your report to go to London, you make yourself look good. Now, I went as deep into this as I could, and my conclusion was that there were 12 killed, 13 if you include Wooster, who died later in Danbury, 28 were wounded, and 16 were captured, for a total of 56 men you would call casualties on our side. The British, 2 were killed by Wooster in either the first or the second engagement. If you remember the engineer Robertson, his journal, he identified 50 or 60 were killed or wounded at Ridgefield, at the barricade, and 4 or 5 officers wounded. You know, the officers weren't considered men. When the men were just the men, officers were a separate accounting, and they were wounded. And between 12 and 20 were missing or captured. So you got 70 to 90 on the British side were total casualties, for a total of maybe 125 to 145 total casualties. That's enough, in my opinion, to say there was a battle took place here. That's just not a rough skirmish in the woods, particularly since we know the order of battle, or we think we know the order of battle from both sides. Well, you know, the $64 million question is, well, who were those guys that died here? And I guess that's still being resolved. From my standpoint, it could have been among 5 different British regiments. The most likely was the 15th Regiment of Foot, which led the charge on the barricade and had 8 killed during the whole campaign. They were from East Yorkshire, so you would think from the forensics, as they did bone and teeth study for diet, they might be able to determine if that was the case. Next would have been the American Volunteer Regiment, the Prince of Wales, the green-jacketed guys who shot at Arnold. Maybe one of them was felled by Arnold himself, since they had 7 killed. My money, though, is on the 12 Connecticut men that died around the barricade, both from the way the burials seem to have taken place and by the sheer likelihood that that's who it would be. So when it comes out who were those skeletons, my money is on Connecticut militia. So before we get to consequences, any questions or concerns about the battle itself? Yeah, Betsy.
So you said Arnold arrived in Ridgefield an hour before the battle?
Well, he arrived. The 3 generals arrived in Bethel, and when they determined that Tryon was not coming back to the way he came toward Fairfield, but was headed towards Ridgefield, Arnold and Silliman with their 400 men quick march cross country, and they had to have predetermined that Ridgefield was the best defensive site because they went directly there. But they only got in town an hour to an hour and a half before the British actually arrived. So the defense they put up, of course they had hundreds of men just grabbing everything they could find. So they stripped fence rails and wagons and casts, probably took stones from a stone fence and threw those in the road too. But yeah.
How did he analyze the geography of the town, where that barricade was going, where the ridges up here, and where these guys are going to go?
The town's like this, the barricade's like this, and the 2 ridges are like this. And the one on the east ridge slopes uphill with rocky ledges, and to High Ridge. And the one towards East Ridge, you know how that goes down to where the athletic field is now. Well, that was kind of a swampy stream area, then back up to orchards that were the Grove Street, right outside our
I guess there were no
doors.
trees, so you could see that pretty plainly.
Yeah, so that's a pretty large front. You're talking several hundred yards from one end of the engagement to another. And that's probably one of the reasons why the casualties were so low for that many men. Because of the distance, these muskets were very hard to aim, even if you tried to aim at that kind of a distance. Plus, of the men who died, many of them were bayoneted. And so that's most likely the barricade men who were caught there. The others on the flank seem to have melted away before real physical contact took place. Although it's just hard to say. 33 men wrote down what happened there, but 550 men didn't. So we're back to Sybil Ludington in terms of
Yeah.
the past and what we remember from the past. Anything else, a question regarding the battle itself? Yeah.
I've heard there's sort of some folklore about Tryon's stragglers who are said to have been lost in the swamp. They're trying to track down sources for this. Haven't found
Well,
anything.
he had 29 men missing for the whole expedition, and we know that at least 13 British were captured among the 40 that were taken by Worcester. The others were probably Teamsters that were local people that they just let them go. We know one straggler was found after the British had camped, and they tried to save him. Ebenezer Jones, who captained the Ridgefield militia, his son ran across this dying British soldier, and they tried to save him. So you don't know how many others. We know that at least 3 of the British deserted in Danbury and went over to the Americans. We don't know did any of the others who were he recalled missing, were they actually deserters or not. So it's very unclear from the British side what happened in Ridgefield versus what happened for the whole Danbury Campo circuit. And all we have really is Robertson's diary on the Ridgefield component. We also know that the American militia here did not break and run like they did at Campo. They somewhat held together. I mean, Arnold was so done with militia after that. He was expecting a second star, and his moment of glory when he could have taken out Tryon at Campo vanished before his eyes when his whole command read. So he fled. So he was. He said he never wanted to be associated with American militia again, but he was, and they saved him. Get to that. Well, consequences. There were a number of them. One, the supply chain for the Continental Army was its Achilles heel. Congress had done an ad hoc patch job creating it, and putting it back together after Danbury was burned made significant changes in how the Continental Army supplied itself. The depots, of course, were moved. Other depots in England were moved farther inland, and Danbury was shut down and never became a major supply depot again. Within the Department of Quartermaster, Congress created the Quartermaster Corps. Then they created a medical corps. Then they created a ordnance corps for cannon and equipment. Then they created a clothing department. Then they created a wagons department. And then they created a foraging department. And then they created a quartermaster department where it all came together. Each one of those departments had a department head in Philadelphia reporting to the War Board. Okay? And the Army is out in the field, and they would send a representative who would be out. But Danbury Depot was a mess in terms of where did those supplies go, because there were 3 different American armies in New England that it supplied, and was generally who could send the highest ranking officer there with a written order for supplies that was saying where the supplies would go. So that was pointed out by the aftermath of Danbury, and so Congress moved to combine the departments, and they really went from 7 to 4, not really a big deal. They decided that there's going to be a monthly inventory of every one of our depots that will go to the War Board as to what are our supplies. How can you go out and buy more if you don't know how many you have? And they gave the Quartermaster Depot, that's actually running the depot, they gave Washington that department himself to run, so that he had control over the depot. He didn't have control over purchasing or the incoming of the supplies, because the states were essentially paying for it or not. So that was a huge consequence, but it really wasn't until after Valley Forge that the American supply chain got its act together under one head who was part of the Army rather than the War Board. And the War Board was essentially John Adams and 4 or 5 other people who showed up or didn't. And John Adams, I think, imagined himself really a general and wanted to be a general like Tryon, but he had the sense, or Abigail had the sense not to go there. The other consequences all came from this man. Is that the very epitome of a puritanical, hardcore Connecticut Yankee, or not?
Yeah.
He was the only governor of all the 13 colonies, other than Rhode Island, who was the governor before the war, who stayed with it. And the Rhode Island governor was away from his office, where Trumbull wasn't. from the very beginning, he was pro-Congress and anti-British. And two things really got under his craw. One was the Church of England, which he, Congregationalist Puritan Trumbull had no time for. And the other were loyalists, because where he came from, on the eastern side of the Connecticut River, that was true blue. That was Congregationalist, pro-Congress, pro-Boston, no doubt about it. And this southern Connecticut full of Tories, he'd had it. So what Trumbull did was a massive build-up. He told Washington, "I'm sorry, George, I am keeping 400 Continental troops to guard my own state." And that was an argument, reading the letters back and forth for months. And he finally, Washington eventually won, because the British never came back. Trumbull didn't need those extra 400 Continentals. He also sent 8 different regiments of militia to the coast because he feared New Haven was going to be next out of Rhode Island. And he convinced Washington to beef up the Continentals that were along the Greenwich, New York supply line. And so he beefed up, and also he sped up the enlistments of the 8 regiments that we were slow to deliver. He really was putting the metal on that, because he ordered that any militiaman who turned out would be paid the same as a Continental Army soldier. So the militia would get paid in the future for their call-ups, and that they wouldn't discriminate with the Continental troops. He was also involved in the Sag Harbor raid, which General Parsons, if you remember, is the one who evidently put it together, in which they equalized Ridgefield by sending 120 men across Long Island Sound to destroy a supply depot of the Loyalists in Sag Harbor. They burned 12 ships full of supplies. They burned the hay that was going to forage for the British cavalry, and they came back with 90 prisoners without losing a man. Tremendous mission. And because Parsons pretty much put that together, it led me to believe that he really was true blue, as you would say. So there's another story here that I stumbled on. I'm sorry to keep taking up much time. Trumbull wanted Washington to swap out the American men that were taken on this raid. There were like 43 prisoners taken back. And Washington refused. He said, "No, I will not trade a British soldier for an American militiaman or an American town selectman," because the British could then start taking hostages all over the place and they'd get back their troops. He would only trade a captured British soldier for a captured American soldier. And he would trade officers of rank for officers of equal rank, which left Trumbull saying, "How do I get my 43 men back?" And I think part of the reason for the Sag Harbor raid was they came back with 90 Loyalist prisoners that Washington then said, "Okay, because they were Loyalist troops, you can swap out." And Trumbull entered into discussions to make a prisoner swap. And we did get about half the prisoners back, but it's unclear how the swap actually took place. There's no real documentation of a man for man there. But I suspect one of the reasons for the raid was to get some prisoners to swap, because Washington said, "Sorry, Jonathan, I'm not going to give up precious British captives for militiamen." So that was a long-lasting consequence, because it was very clear to the British, you come in and raid one of our depots again, and we can take out one of yours. Trumbull cracked down with the legislature on Loyalists. Up until the Danbury raid and the Battle of Ridgefield, the only oath that you had to take was an oath of passivity if you were thought to be a Loyalist. So if you were thought to be or proven to be a Loyalist, you went to court and swore oath you would be passive. You didn't have to say, "I give up on the king. I will be passive and I will not do anything." And that way, and you posted a bond. After the Battle of Ridgefield, where Connecticut men actually stood up and fought, things changed. A loyalty oath was required of everyone who was a freeman. They don't mention women at the time, because women were not voters and were not serving in the military. Everyone was required to take an oath, and not only that, you had a signed paper that you had taken the oath, and without that signed paper, you could not trade real estate, you could not travel from town to town, and you could not vote. So if you were a loyalist and you refused to take the oath, you went to jail. So, and if you did take the oath, you could move around, but it was very clear that if you violated the oath, you were in jail. And then Trumbull did an amazing thing. After putting those penalties, he said, and any loyalist who wants to swear that they adopt the Continental Cause and swear their loyalty to Congress are pardoned. So that kind of put to rest the loyalists thinking, why should I stay and fight? I'm forgiven. I don't have to have a sign pass in order to leave my house anymore. And I don't have a number on the number of pardons that took place because that was town by town. But that didn't eliminate loyalism in Fairfield County. But the combination of all of that together with the militia being fired up pretty much ended any threat of the British coming. And they didn't come back. Never again did the British come to inland Connecticut. Another consequence was this: because the British never came back, elements of the Fairfield County militia didn't have to guard the border anymore. They were sent up to the Highlands, and 1,200 Connecticut militia participated in the Battle of Saratoga, since they didn't have to defend the state anymore. And that's essentially because at Ridgefield, enough men stood up to fight that the message was that this is not British country anymore. And Sir William Howe was not about to send another fishing expedition out because his troops were important to him, and he wasn't going to lose redcoats for partisan warfare in Connecticut. So part of Saratoga was the 1,200 militia from Connecticut that were there. And of course, the ultimate consequence is Arnold himself. I mean, he was a hero. He really put the troops together. He lost his horse. He could have been killed. He gathered the troops the next day and fought at Campo Bay, where he lost the horse again. And Congress gave him his second star, just like he got his first. And he ended up at Saratoga, of course. And of the two deciding battles at Saratoga, Arnold was in the forefront in leading both of those. And in both of them, about half of his troops were militia, Connecticut militia. And the thing about militia, when they could smell victory, they fought a whole lot differently from when they could smell defeat, because they were men with families at home, and they knew when it was going to go the wrong way, get out of town. But they knew it was going the right way, then who didn't want to be part of the victory. And Saratoga was one of the turning points of the war, if not the turning point of the war. And so Arnold being there instead of resigning was a critical factor in Saratoga. So for a lot of reasons, standing up and resisting at Ridgefield, and then those same troops gathering and resisting again at Campo, did contribute to ensuring that England did not win the war and did not get back to Connecticut. Now, you know Tryon, his ambition was, I'm going to be this general that takes over Connecticut, etc. He was like a suitor spurned at the altar. He was angry because his vision that he told London and he told Sir William Howe didn't happen, and so he had some egg on his face. And so in 1779, he gained back no civility. He burned Norwalk, he burned Fairfield, and he was part of overseeing the group that burned New Haven, and which Arnold was part of when he turned coat. So I guess Tryon got a last word in the end, but never again did he or anyone else from the British Crown march back into the inland Connecticut. They knew they would lose troops, and they did. They lost nearly 11% of their force. So the last word, I guess, we leave with Tryon. This is what ran in the London Evening Post, 2 months after. Tryon was selected for this business in hopes his appearance in the country should draw numbers to join him, but it had not that effect. He has no influence beyond New York. And so you could just imagine William Howe thinking to himself, I told him so, I told him so. And William Howe then pretty much had little to do with Governor Tryon in a military capacity. So that's the latest on the Battle of Ridgefield to be continued. So thank you for.
Thank you.
How long did that run, Stephen? Will you time me?
An hour 30.
faster tomorrow night. Okay.
This is wonderful.
Good.
Does anyone have any questions for Keith? Any other comments about things that you've heard about the Battle of Ridgefield during your time living here in town?
Yeah, 25 years from now, I'm going to write another book, so maybe know something.
I'd just like to say that the book is wonderful. I've been reading it this
thank
past week, and it's so lively, and you give such pictures of the characters involved. It's not very dry at all. I
Thank
highly
you.
recommend it.
Thank you. Well, that's good news, but my last book on John Lawrence, my son tried to read it. He didn't get it through. He said, Dad, this is just so dense, I just can't keep going. So I'll see how far he gets on this. Thank you, Sally. I appreciate it. It's fascinating. These five men, each of their ambitions and how they operated on the ground, and then finding that Washington was involved from day one on Danbury all the way through was kind of really interesting to find for me.
You should mention too that Erskine's nickname was Wooly, which
Wooly,
I thought
yeah,
was just wonderful.
Wooly, and you see that mop of hair on his head, and you could see why. Yeah, Wooly was tremendous in that at Princeton. Sorry for going on. When Cornwallis pretty much had Washington's army, but decided to camp for the night and saying we'll bag the old fox in the morning, Erskine was a general who told him, no, if he's the general I think he is, he won't be there in the morning. And had Cornwallis followed Erskine's advice and taken Washington, then when he had the numbers, the outcome of the war could have been different. I mean, it's like World War II. If Patton had been given this way, Europe might have been a different D-Day than the one we have. And so probably in every war there is a general who's closer to the ground, who knows the right thing to do, but the egos of superiors offset it. And it was kind of fun seeing Wooly Erskine in that role there. He was called then by King George himself to be his military advisor about a year after Ridgefield. That he wanted Erskine to be his man on the ground when it came to the war, because there were wars in Europe as well. So, well, thank you all for putting up with it, and I hope you enjoy
Thank you.
reading the book, and anything you can do to help this place get bigger and stronger, God bless you.
Thank you again, Keith, for sharing your latest research on this pivotal moment in Ridgefield's history and in the founding of the United States of America. It took place here in Ridgefield, Connecticut, and I do encourage all of you to pick up a copy of Keith's wonderful new book on the Battle of Ridgefield. It's available here at the Scott House, and we're open on Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday from 1 to 5, and it's also on our website for those of you who live out of the area. And I also wanted to mention the Ridgefield Historical Society is very excited to be participating in Phase 2 of the National Park Service Battle of Ridgefield Archaeology Project. We're working on this project over the next couple years, and very excited by the potential of archaeological excavations and additional evidence of the battle here in Ridgefield. And if there are any property owners here in town who are watching this broadcast, please reach out to the Historical Society if you'd like your property considered for this study. Thank you so much for joining us today, and we will see you at our next gathering on Tuesday, October 15th, when we'll be talking about the history of the Danbury Fair.
Thanks, Steve.
Okay.